I think a lot of folks who only know and play Wizards of the Coast's 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons love that game because it has given them 3 kinds of moments with their friends. Moments of fear, as in worry that their character will get hurt or killed. Moments of triumph, either by their cleverness or a lucky roll of the dice. And moments of hilarity, where a joke or line or comment at the table creates a good laugh. What those folks don't know or realize is that D&D 5e can create those moments, but it is not really specifically engineered to generate them. It's a bit of a hodgepodge in terms of game design and intent. Dungeon Crawl Classics, on the other hand, has developed a cultish devotion and following because it has, in fact, been created to be an engine of those moments: danger, triumph, and hilarity. It does this by being particularly brutal with its level 0 funnel and low level deadliness, with its potentially very powerful class abilities like magic, if you're lucky, or backstab, and with the fact that nothing in this game is taking itself too seriously, especially if you take the cues from the artwork in this core rulebook. In other words, this game is more Dungeons & Dragons than Dungeons & Dragons itself because it just gets what people find most enjoyable about the game and delivers it. Dungeon Crawl Classics has been around for a long time now. It started off as an offshoot of Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition rules back in 2003 and evolved with D&D's 4th edition, but then in 2012, the author Joseph Goodman of Goodman Games created a completely revamped version of the rules that went way back in time. Now, what I'm about to say is controversial amongst some DCC fanboys and disputes what Joseph Goodman himself says at the end of this core rulebook that I'm about to walk you through in this video. But basically, this modern version is a D&D retro clone, specifically of the BX edition. And by extension, it's an old school Renaissance or OSR game by almost every single measure. But unlike the nearly verbatim copies of BX that you might see in other retro clones, such as the famous and beautifully laid out Old School Essentials by Gavin Norman, DCC adds to a lot of those dusty old rules from the early 80s. And it's not just new mechanics bolted on for more dangerous magic or weird new dice that will confuse the hell out of you. There's a brash personality and attitude infused in this core rulebook that has energized a relatively large and very cultish and devoted following over the years. As always, I'm going to show you what I'm talking about by just showing the pages straight out of the book. Maybe you can draw your own conclusions about Dungeon Crawl Classics. One of the most remarkable aspects of this game is not exactly the game itself, but how Goodman Games has built up and embraced its fans. What I'm showing you here is the 10th printing of the game, and in the first few pages, you see a list of supporters and members of the community, as well as photos of regular folks just sitting at the table in random conventions playing this game. It's not a particularly appealing set of photos, and you can barely make out any faces, but the point is that this game's publisher cherishes its fans and commemorates them in a way that I don't think I've ever seen with an RPG. It also just happens that Goodman Games publishes an annual yearbook that contains even more of this kind of stuff. An affirmation of the community around Dungeon Crawl Classics. The yearbook also contains usable game information and other fun detritus. The summary of the game's rules answers one of the biggest questions some of you might have about this game, which is, what kind of rule system does it use? Again, despite the author's own declarations to the contrary found at the end of this book, this game is pretty firmly OSR, both in rules and in spirit. There are some deviations from D&D BX rules, but otherwise, that's what you're getting here. A unique but quite familiar retro clone of BX. We'll go over all the nuances of the rules later in the video. I do want to touch on another major contradiction made early on in this book and later repeatedly refuted, and that is this bit here about your character not being a hero. I love this declaration right here that in this game you play as a sort of rogue or scoundrel, but it's simply not true unless you want it to be at your table. Countless times throughout the rest of this book, PCs are literally referred to as heroes. On a more positive note, check out this artwork. This retro style may or may not be nostalgic for you, but I can assure you that once you see enough of it, it starts to grow on you. Alright, so DCC might more or less be a D&D retro clone, but it brings some pretty compelling innovations to the table. One of the most famous and interesting ones is the so-called funnel. The concept is that everyone starts their character at level 0, or rather characters. Each player is asked to roll up 2 to 4 different peasants, armed with little more than a tool from their profession and maybe some crappy equipment. So with a table of 4 players and 4 level 0s each, That's 16 peasants entering the fray. And that fray is a specifically designed scenario called a level 0 funnel. There are many which have been published over the years, so there's no problem with finding one. What happens then is that these peasants get decimated, and by the end of it, any survivors are awarded with 10 XP, bringing them to level 1 and the choice of what class they will be. In other words, a level 0 funnel is a character creation session drenched in blood. The funnel concept is fairly unique to DCC and has even spawned a bit of ritualistic subculture. For example, Goodman Games sells an official death stamp that you can punch onto players' character sheets. And the official, unofficial website, purplesorcerer.com, has even created an online generator that makes 4 level 0 peasants for you with as little as 1 click. Another major innovation to the basic expert D&D rules from the early 80s is the so-called Zachi dice. These are a D3, D5, D7, D14, D16, D24, and D30. They are added to your standard set of 7 polyhedrals and create a dice chain, which act as step dice when assessing advantages and disadvantages on a check. You also have modifiers to a roll in this game as well. So for example, you might normally roll a D20 for something, but you're cursed for some reason and have to roll a D16 instead, but you might have an item that lends a +1 to that particular roll. Okay, I'll just share with you my mixed feelings on these funky dice right now. On the plus side, these dice reawaken that feeling that you first had the very first time you laid eyes on a set of polyhedral dice. Do you remember that moment? I can only speak for myself, but I assume most people felt a mix of fascination, intimidation, and burning curiosity. But as you know, those dice became commonplace, and the impossible eventually happened. You were able to identify them at a glance. Well, the Zachi dice put you right back at square one, where you're looking at strange and inscrutable polyhedrals that seem unnatural, and telling them apart from each other, again, seems impossible. So here's the thing. The telling them apart from each other is actually a problem. It's such a problem that Goodman Games actually sells special dice trays that help you keep them sorted and labeled. If you have a 3D printer, you can also print out such a tray for yourself, like I have. Another problem with these dice is that the substitute for each is not practical. I know that the author and a lot of adherents to this rule system hand wave it and say it's super simple to convert the normal set of 7 dice to funky rolls, but it's not practical. You'd be advised to just use a free online dice roller that incorporates the funky dice, rather than fiddle with all these conversions. But that brings me to my next point. As soon as you start using an online roller instead of the physical dice, that glorious mystique that I was talking about a second ago is gone. Once you're tapping buttons on a screen to roll these dice, it's nothing more than a clerical task to serve the game's math. And about that math, my final gripe about these dice is that they don't really add much mathematical or statistical nuance to the game, at least not from what I could deduce or find online. Notice the increments between each of these dice. Why are these increments the way they are? And could this step function just be accomplished with more modifiers, like 99.9% of RPGs? But you know, despite all my whinging and moaning, I can't help but find these dice alluring and fun, as long as I'm using them physically and not on a digital dice roller. I'm not going to go over all the basic rules that were cribbed from the old Dungeons & Dragons here in this video. It's a rollover D20 system where you try to meet or beat a difficulty class. You have 6 core stats, and in this case, 3 saving throw stats. There is a feature of your character, though, that is pretty unique and pretty heavily emphasized in this game, and that's luck. Each character has a luck score as well as a luck modifier. In essence, you can burn luck points like a meta currency to improve rolls, and your luck modifier can apply to all sorts of actions in the game. Here are about 92 starting occupations that you can pick for your level 0 peasant. Your occupation here will very likely inform your class choice if you get to level 1. Alignment is broken out into 3 choices: lawful, chaotic, and neutral. And the default setting in this game has deities associated with each. Alignment and deities are particularly important if you choose cleric as your class. Leveling up is relatively simple. You can see from this chart here that you level up at particular low number thresholds, and the level cap is 10 in this game. But rest assured, if you get a character up past 6 or so, the survival rate becomes quite high. So there are 7 original classes to choose from in this core rulebook. Obviously, in the many years since this game has come out, there have been dozens, even hundreds of additional classes published, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Each of the classes here is constructed with some unique mechanics. The cleric, for example, has to act within the scope of their alignment, either good, chaotic, or neutral. And even if they do, anytime they fail a spell check, they risk disapproval from their god. If they trigger actual disapproval, they roll on this table and suffer the consequences. They also get some default spells like Turn Unholy and Lay on Hands. You can see here from this table that DCC does not abandon the original D&D convention of Vancian magic, whereby spells are categorized by level, cross-referenced, and not to be confused with character level, and spells can only be cast about once per day on average. Here's the list of default gods in the vanilla DCC setting. If these names sound like something out of a Conan novel, that's because this entire game was written in service to the literature of Robert E. Howard and other authors who paved the way to the birth of fantasy RPG in the first place. Thief is an interesting class because of one particular feature, their daily luck regeneration. Even out of the gate, they are able to recover luck far faster than other classes and can thereby burn luck more frequently, juicing their rolls when they need it most. Another really notable feature that makes them engines of murder is backstab, which gives them a critical hit if they hit at all. The warrior's special mechanic is a special die called a deed die. You roll this die alongside any other dice when making an attack roll, and if the deed die is 3 or higher, the deed succeeds. The deed in these cases is a special flourish or action, and is left up to the player to describe. This can come in the form of some acrobatic or Hollywood-style shenanigan. Wizards are glass cannons in this game, extremely weak on defense and strong on offense, but it's actually not as simple as that. Regardless of where they draw their magic from, they make terrible risks every time they even learn a spell. Due to the system of mercurial magic used in this game, every new spell comes with a roll on this D100 table. On the lower end of this table, the new spell is essentially a curse, one that materially changes your PC or affects the whole party in a variety of horrible ways. At the higher end of the infamous mercurial magic table, however, a new spell is nothing short of a boon, blessing your character in one way or another. This whole mercurial magic thing is actually one of the marquee features of DCC, and I think it keeps players coming back because the results just make for really funny and fun moments. I think it bears mentioning that there are 3 race-based classes in this game, the dwarf, elf, and halfling, which is a throwback to old D&D. This game does not retract or modify anything in terms of biological determinism. Dwarves have certain features and abilities because they are dwarves. And elves are elves in every average, typical milquetoast fantasy sense of the word. Actually, at the end of this book, the author declares that the fantasy races in this book should be reimagined outside of the Gygaxian norm. I'm not sure if he was just referring to the monsters you're supposed to kill, because the playable fantasy races here are about as generic as you could possibly imagine. But like I mentioned before, this is a retro clone of BXD&D, so some things are going to just be carbon copied from the original set of games. The currency system and general presentation of gear and equipment is pretty much the same. Combat is largely the same, except each character actually has a specific action die, sometimes 2 or more. That's the die that they use to make a check in combat. Usually it's a d20, but remember that for different reasons, an action die can graduate up and down the dice chain. A natural 1 rolled with an action die is a fumble, which can lead to a variety of negative effects. Here's a list of fumbles. They're what you might expect when you roll a 1 in a game like this. A natural 20 or 24 or 30, if you're rolling those higher dice, results in a critical hit. The actual effect of a critical hit depends on your class and level. Some people actually complain about DCC having too many tables, which slows down gameplay. This might be an example of where that's the case. Here you have a crit table specifically for 0 level and wizards, as well as one for thieves and elves, then one for clerics, halflings, level 1 and 2 warriors, and level 1, 2, and 3 dwarves, and so on. There can be a lot of specificity with certain aspects of this game, which clashes with its otherwise casual and open-ended nature, but in defense of this game, the author does openly invite you to ignore any and all the rules that you don't like. So in the case of all these crit tables, for example, you could instead just opt for a single table that can apply generally to all classes, or not use a table at all and just narrate a critical hit in a way that makes sense in the fiction in the moment. Death in this game comes to any level 0 character who reaches 0 hit points. Then 0 HP means you're bleeding out and you have 1 round to be stabilized. You get an extra round to be stabilized for every extra level you have thereafter. There's this really generous rule here that says that if another PC reaches your presumably dead body within an hour of your falling, they can make a luck check to see if you were merely rendered unconscious. If they succeed in the luck roll, you just sort of wake up and gain 1 HP on the spot. There's this huge minigame called Spell Duels where 2 or more casters can go at it hurling spells at each other until one wins. It's a special set of combat rules that operates differently from standard combat. I think the most curious thing about these rules is how granular they are. Surely they were born out of endless sweaty hours of debate. It's actually 6 full pages of rules, complete with 3 elaborate tables. One sort of irrelevant detail here, but one that I found interesting, is that this is the only table I've ever seen that contains illustrations inside of it. We touched on magic a couple times in this video already, but there's one major feature that I wanted to mention. It's one that counts as yet another significant innovation to the old D&D rules and which is widely loved and admired, and that feature is spell burn. Before rolling any spell check, a wizard in particular can declare that they will attempt spell burn. This means they temporarily spend points of their strength, agility, or stamina score to add points to their spell check on a 1-for-1 basis. They recover their ability scores at a rate of 1 point per day as long as they don't spell burn in that time. You can actually cast spells that have otherwise been exhausted for the day, which is nice, but you do have to roleplay some kind of weird or gross sacrifice whenever a spell burn is committed, as described on this D24 table. Also, if you roll a 1 on such a spell check, you pick up corruption, either minor, major, or greater. Corruption is a pretty serious alteration to your character in many, if not most cases. Just in the minor corruptions table, you can end up with mutated ears, a disfigured face, or suddenly have one leg permanently much longer than the other. At higher levels of corruption, we're talking horns, forked tongues, flesh falling off in chunks, a crab claw, or a body covered in feathers. In other words, magical mishaps in this game will lead to comedy gold. So here's yet another unique and frankly kind of stunning feature of DCC. You have all the wizard spells listed here from 1st to 5th level in power. These are described as just some of the spells in the universe, by the way. And here are the much fewer cleric spells, as well as spells tied specifically to different patrons. But here's the crazy thing. For every single one of these spells, there is about a page of description. They all have their level, range, duration, casting time, and general description, just like with most RPGs. But here you will also get a variety of possible manifestations, a corruption range, and a variety of misfire possibilities. And finally, you get a detailed table of possible results depending on your casting roll for that spell. Check out Magic Missile. The descriptions of the possible corruption and misfires is tremendously verbose, and the possible outcomes for the cast equally so. Here's the spell Locate Object. I don't know about you, but the description of the possible effects here may cross the line in terms of comfortable word count. And by the way, this spell description spills over to the next page here. I don't think anyone but the most hardcore of DCC fans really love this amount of description with their spells. But then again, not all spells are multi-pagers. Most of them fit onto one page, like these two. This is just a feature of magic in DCC. You can take it or leave it. Anyway, it's about 170 pages of the book. If you were ever intimidated by the thickness of the DCC core rulebook, just remember that the spells comprise 33% of that page count. One thing I mentioned before, but I'll just show you here, is that this game is very much OSR in spirit. Note here the author's philosophy of rulings over rules, or in his words, let the rules bend to you, not the other way around. And again, fear no rule. Also, let the characters die if the dice so dictate. This is all in line with foundational OSR gameplay principles. There are a few really cool generators at the end of the book for GMs or judges, one of which is the Magic Sword Creator. My favorite bit about this one is the hard and fast rule that all magical swords are intelligent and have their own independent desires. I love the story possibilities for that. The author's philosophy on monsters is also pretty brilliant. In a nutshell, he says to never refer to a monster by its name. Instead, put yourself in the mindset of an ignorant peasant who has never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. Instead of a minotaur kicking around in the nearby caves, it's a singular beast who locals call by many names, mostly descriptive in nature. Make each monster rare and unknown is the point. That is at the heart of true fantasy. You can use this table to create completely unique monsters, although the book also contains a decent collection of prototypical fantasy monsters as well. Again, you as the judge need to do what you have to mix things up and not use painfully generic monsters. The 100 or so statted at the end of this book should be used as a starting point. One of the most significant sections in the book is this one right here, titled Appendix N. Essentially, it's a list of the author's literary inspirations for making DCC and his declaration that he made this game in order to emulate the adventures found in those books. This list of books here actually comes from Gary Gygax's 1979 version of D&D, but Goodman adds a lot more authors here as well, including Clark Ashton Smith, Carl Edgar Wagner, Edgar Allan Poe, Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood, William Hope Hodgson, and Harold Lamb. This is all vintage horror and fantasy from the 19th and 20th century, if you're wondering. I personally have only read a small fraction of the stuff mentioned here, but I get what he was trying to do. He was trying to get to the source of D&D's inspiration, not necessarily use D&D itself as the inspiration. Regardless of if he succeeded or not, this is a great reading list. Alright, here are my thoughts on Dungeon Crawl Classics. Judges need experience to run this game well. The book even says it outright. And there are at least half a dozen places in the book where instead of describing a rule or game aspect in detail, the author just says to ask your judge, assuming a certain level of knowledge and confidence. Zachi dice. They are essentially a superficial novelty and don't really mathematically enhance the game's outcomes as far as I can reckon. The dice inject some long-lost mystique into the game, but if you're using an online dice roller, that mystique is completely negated. Physical book bifurcation. The core rulebook could benefit from being split into the core rules and a spell book, since the spell descriptions account for such a huge portion. Slimmer volumes would make the book much easier to read and handle. Magic is dangerous, varied, and hilarious. Between the mercurial magic table that dictates what happens to you each time you learn any spell, to the various misfires and the self-inflicted danger of spell burn, the magic system in this game is unique and fun. And most importantly, it can be really funny. Funnel concept. The concept of filtering a bunch of level 0 peasants through a gauntlet of death in order to see which character you actually start an adventure with is just amazing. It's not only funny in a very dark way, it adds a lot of meaning to whichever character you do manage to have survive into level 1. Nostalgic artwork. I really feel that the artwork is integral to what this game is trying to do, which is deliver a game experience that feels old and dusty in a good way, even when the game is being infused with all kinds of rules innovations. Great reading list. Appendix N is full of classics that I will probably spend the rest of my life exploring. Abundance of resources. The community behind DCC do not just play and run this game, they create a lot of resources for it. You'll find a number of important resources listed at the back of the book, perhaps most importantly for beginners, the level 0 generator, but also like the DCC reference booklet, which is $9.99 officially, free in digital form, or $6.66 as a print-on-demand book directly from the creators. There's also an ongoing master list of all resources kept on a Google Doc that I've linked to down below. This is definitely something you should bookmark if you're thinking of going down the DCC rabbit hole. Universe of modules. There are just hundreds of official modules at this point. I don't know how many fan-published ones. You're spoiled for choice here. Several other major settings. Once you learn the basic mechanics of this game, you have Mutant Crawl Classics and X-Crawl Classics available to you. You also have the Lankmar setting and the Dying Earth setting inspired by Jack Vance himself. I've actually read a few Dying Earth novels, and I'm hoping to explore this particular setting a bit more in future videos. So let me know your thoughts and experiences regarding Dungeon Crawl Classics down in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching. See ya!